Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. John Douillard, and welcome to the LifeSpa podcast, where we prove the ancient medical wisdom of Ayurveda with modern science. And today we have a special return guest, Dr. Paula Witt-Enderby. She is a researcher on melatonin. She's a professor of pharmacology at Duquesne University School of Pharmacy. She's a past Marie Clement Rodier endowed chair. She's also a board certified Ayurvedic health counselor. She's been doing study after study after study on melatonin and osteoporosis, on melatonin and breast cancer, and basically pretty much one of the leading experts in the world about melatonin. And we had her on a couple of years back on our podcast where she talked about her research on osteoporosis and melatonin. And since then, she's done a lot more amazing research, and we're having her back on again. She is an amazing guest. You guys are gonna love this podcast because we take a deep dive into everything melatonin and hopefully answer all of your melatonin circadian rhythm questions. Dr. Paula Witt-Enderby, thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited about having you back on again. The first podcast we did about your research on melatonin and osteoporosis and breast cancer was amazing. It's one of our most viewed. I send it to almost all of my patients because as we age, melatonin is something, of course, that declines as we age, and it's one of those things that is really not talked about. The research is buried. You go to the doctor, they're not going to tell you about melatonin and the benefits of it. And that's why what you share is so critically important. So thanks for being here. I want to start by asking you a question about if we could just do like a quick recap about your original research on melatonin and osteoporosis and kind of how that works, and we'll dive in, and then we'll kind of go into your new research and dig in deeper into this whole area, because there's, I'm sure, tons of research we need to talk about here.
Yeah, can I start it out? I always love to be able to tell this story. When I was at Northwestern University Medical School, I was doing a postdoc, and we were lucky enough to get these clones to make these recombinant cell models. And so we had the human receptors that were cloned from Stephen Reppert. And we were able, because no one knew how the receptors functioned, because everyone's like, do they desensitize or how do they act? Because they're being exposed to melatonin for 8 hours every night, sometimes 12 hours, depending on the season. And so we took the human MT1 receptor, human MT2, and then we had these control cells. And what we found is that when we put on melatonin on the MT1 containing cells, when I was doing studies, the cells would fall off a cover slip. And I would say, oh, that's because I was looking at a signaling mechanism, like a phosphorylation of a protein. And I said, why are these cells not on here? Am I washing it too hard? And what we found is that melatonin in those cells only, were hyper elongating them, so making them really long. And they lost their adherence to the cover slip and we found that they were going up and over and up and over and up and over cells, making these cool contacts. And that kind of started everything. It was like, why those receptors? And now I had a system where we can actually map out the pathway that did that. The reason I like to bring that up is that led into work that I started doing in cancer lines, looking at neurite outgrowth for neuroblastoma cells. And then I said, I want to look to see, does this happen physiologically? And I happen to have a colleague, Dr. John Doctor was his name. He has since passed. Fantastic colleague. We had a stairwell conversation. He had just come back from a sabbatical at Carnegie Mellon, and he's like, oh, we got these mesenchymal stem cells that you can look at because they differentiate into an osteoblast. And so lo and behold, we test melatonin on it, and then that is literally the entrance into this field for me, because melatonin was so potent on those cells, and we were able to map out the pathways with that. So fast forward, we tested it in the cell lines, we mapped out these pathways, we looked at it in animals, we were able to show increases in bone density. And then I was so lucky that because melatonin's over the counter, I could actually run clinical trials. So I never did those. And so I team up with people that I, get to, that I'm not an ex, when I'm not an expert in something, I find people who are experts. And then so we wanted to test to see if melatonin could help with recovering so we have bone markers. So we have markers that osteoblasts secrete, those are your bone forming cells. And we have markers that osteoclasts secrete, those are your bone breakdown cells. And when they get out of whack, which they do during perimenopause, and so that can happen starting even at the age of 40 for some women, those bone breakdown cells, osteoclasts, start outpacing the bone formation cells. And that's where you start to see a lot of bone deterioration. So in that study, we actually showed that melatonin renormalized those bone markers, but only when you looked at them as ratios. And then, because you can't really look at a bone cell as independent. Bone forming cells, osteoblasts work with osteoclasts, and we call that bone remodeling. So we found that renormalized, but we also showed that women's menstrual cycles renormalized. So they were going about 7 over 6 months back to 6. We were showing that their mental health, like energy levels, were getting better. So I always like to look at subjective health outcomes because what the person says matters. Like we can say, oh, you're doing really well. And the person says, no, I'm not. So I learned this from another colleague that did that kind of work. And I've always include that in my research now. So that was like the beginning. That was a 6-month study with 3 milligrams melatonin for 6 months. But then we started combining them with other things to make it work better. So that was where we use strontium citrate, vitamin D, and then vitamin K. K2. And then we also, now I'm actually doing research where we're combining it with exercise interventions or bone loading. So trying to move more towards things that anybody can use in a healthy way. So my lab is kind of cool in that it's translational. We go all the way down to stem cells and we do fancy stuff like CRISPR-Cas knockout of genes. And we study it in animal models, but also in clinical trials. And then I have this other cool thing where I do with my Ayurvedic holistic side where I try and then blend and I say, well, Ayurveda uses this for mental health. Let's see if it works in our lab. So that's kind of in a nutshell what I do.
Okay, so what you said is a mouthful. Let me see if I can recap and tell me if I get this right. There's a ratio between the cells, the osteoclasts that break down bone, and there's ones that actually called osteoblasts that build up bone. And after menopause, what happens is that relationship starts to get out of whack. You have more breakdown versus building up of the bone. And what you were saying is that the melatonin actually brings this balance back and encourages the production of more osteoblastic activity where it actually does build bone. And you said that the dose was 3 milligrams. That was a time release dose throughout the night, right?
No, that was fast release.
Just fast release, 3 milligrams. And how long did it take for that 3 milligrams to actually increase bone density? And at what rate did it increase bone density? If someone has osteopenia, how long would it take for them to see some changes theoretically?
1 year. So that study in that study, we didn't measure bone density. We measured just bone marker turnover. But then we since now have run a study where we did bone loading plus 5 milligrams of melatonin for a year. And so that study's in submission. So we'll be able to talk more about that when things get published. But it usually takes about a year to see bone changes.
Okay.
And so we chose 5 milligrams because other people people are showing effects with 3 and 5 milligrams.
Those are the classic research.
Yeah, but nighttime doses. They have to be taken during the nighttime.
Okay. And you also said that you saw some improvements in just the menstrual regularity and I think PMS and hot flashes and many of the kind of the postmenopausal symptoms. Is that right? Is that true as well?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it had to do with re-entraining the circadian rhythms. Like everything we see is like if you get good sleep, and we say good, dark, high quality sleep, a lot of times that can correct a lot of the things that people are suffering from. So the most bothersome thing are the hot flashes and the vasomotor symptom issues. So a lot of times it's more that they just had better rest. They have more energy the next day. So it's kind of like melatonin being re-entraining your sleep cycles to the light-dark cycle. So that's what I always stress is like as much as you can, try and get as much natural lighting as you can during the day. Obviously, be careful with the sun in your skin, but try and get dark sleep. And so I always recommend eye mask or something to kind of shield the light. But again, I don't have shades in I keep my shades up because I want to have the sun come in naturally. But again, while you're sleeping, you can always wear very light, nice eye masks. People find those to be pretty amazing in terms of how much better their sleep is.
So let's kind of see if I can kind of put this in a box. We have melatonin, which we know is more of a molecule than a hormone because it actually seems to kind of bring the rhythm of our biological clocks in sync with nature's light-dark circadian cycle.
And seasons.
So it puts us back into rhythm, and that allows us to have deeper sleep. And of course, we know that if you just look at the research on just getting good sleep, how many great things would happen to you. But melatonin is so much more than just a molecule to reset circadian rhythms. It's one of the body's most powerful antioxidants, right? So what role does melatonin play? Is it the janitor that comes in at night and does floors and windows and cleans and detoxifies? Is that what's happening with melatonin in addition to the circadian rhythm resetting? Or is it just get the body in rhythm and the body takes care of itself?
No, that's a great question. No, absolutely not. It's like like I said before, it's a really cool molecule. I'm a pharmacologist, study drugs by training, and I always found this melatonin to be so fascinating because depending on the dose you take, it either is going to work through receptors and through signaling cascades, or at higher doses, it's going to work as a free radical scavenger and quite a potent one at that, even better than glutathione. So that's like our natural one that comes from our liver, but even better than vitamins A and E or C and E. So, so in various parts of our organs, melatonin, including bone, including the gut, there are higher concentrations, including the mitochondria. And so melatonin is found to be able to sop up free radicals. So these are these molecules that are made after you eat. We all get them. I mean, even though you're trying to have a good diet and just living creates free radicals. And so that is an unstable molecule that wants to bind up to anything to stabilize its electron shell. And so melatonin is there to take it on. And what's very different with melatonin than other molecules is its metabolites that take on the radicals are still stable. So a lot of times these radicals can stay around for even a couple of minutes, and that's very long compared to other ones. So it makes sense that it's in bone. It makes sense that it's by the ovary. It makes sense that it's in the gut because these are areas where you can generate free radicals and kill cells. So a whole different set of studies show that maybe melatonin through its free radical scavenging properties is protecting eggs in the ovary or protecting that tissue because when people go into menopause, they're losing their eggs or in their bone. We always write about this. We always include this that melatonin is not only inducing osteoblasts, but we think it's protecting the bone cells from dying. And the same thing just in the gut. It's preventing misfolding of proteins. So because we're, digesting a lot in our GI tract. So based on the amount, so based on how much you take or how much your body makes in the various tissues is going to determine what its actions are. And that's a very cool property of it. I think it's just so interesting at so many levels, at a scientific level. So yes, it's beyond a circadian and trainer. And actually, I feel like you have to take all of those things into account when you are writing about melatonin or even discussing it. You can't just pinpoint it to just one mechanism.
Right. I think Russ Ryder talked about, one of the original researchers talked about, it's a 3 billion year old molecule.
That's fascinating.
Every living creature,
everything
has it, right? So this is like something that's not like the new thing. We evolved with this to keep these these biological clocks and circadian rhythms in sync. Now, okay, so here's what we know: that melatonin declines as you age. which means that what you're talking about is it provides not only circadian rhythm resetting, but it also provides an antioxidant protection. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that. And I want to talk about mitochondrial health, which is like the buzz, right? Everything's mitochondria these days. And we know that when the body makes energy, it makes free radical or reactive oxygen species. It creates damage. And DNA damage is something that occurs as a result of us making energy. And as we get older, we don't get rid of that free radical damage as well. And we also know, which is really interesting, that the melatonin that helps us go to sleep at night is only 10%, right, of the melatonin in the body. And 90% of the melatonin in the body is inside the cell, swabbing up all the free radical damage from energy production and protecting us from age-related DNA damage. And that comes from the infrared light of the sun, which we should be be in the sun. That activates that enzyme, the cytochrome C oxidase enzyme that activates the production of ATP. And also, that same enzyme activates the production of melatonin inside the cell, which, just like you said, that antioxidant, melatonin, is the one that our body chose to swab up the most damaging free radical damage in our body, which is the waste products from energy production in the cell. So my question to you is, other than that's like amazingly cool. Everybody thinks melatonin is like the sleep thing, and yet 90% of it comes from the sun. It has nothing to do with, right? That's just like
and food and just a lot of things. Yeah.
Right. So how does melatonin affect our other than what I just talked about from the sun, but the melatonin at nighttime, does that janitor come in and actually protect us from mitochondrial damage and dysfunction of our mitochondria as well? Because we have the melatonin inside the cell, which is 90%, which does clean up for the mitochondria, but the nighttime melatonin that we don't produce as we age and therefore could possibly supplement for, what role does that melatonin have on mitochondrial health?
Well, you know what's really cool about that? So I was lucky enough to work with a group, Bob Friedlander's group. He's a head neurosurgeon at Pitt right now. And he is actually the one that discovered the mitochondrial melatonin receptor. So literally so melatonin receptors exist in the outside membrane of a cell. We call it the plasma membrane. But there's a whole set of melatonin receptors coupled to very similar proteins, like mimicking what you see in the plasma membrane. So melatonin can work on its own in the mitochondria. So it can actually, do what you were saying, but also what it's thinking is it helps to stabilize the mitochondrial matrix, which is so every organelle, which is like little tiny organs within a cell, are encased in a membrane. And so what happens is when you go through a lot of oxidative phosphorylation, which is the metabolism, free radicals can seep out into the cell and start damaging DNA. It could start making cross links with things, misfolding proteins. So one of the things besides acting as a free radical scavenger, so that you have to clarify between antioxidant versus free radical scavenger because they're different. One is inducing enzymes that help to detox the body, but also one is where melatonin actually takes on the radical. But also it can stabilize the mitochondrial membranes. And so it helps to prevent those free radicals from leaking out into the cell and destroying it. But that is what's really cool is that, melatonin does accumulate in the mitochondria, and it's thought to accumulate through these like little transporters. And you can actually achieve higher levels of melatonin in various parts of the cell, depending on what the energy needs are. So isn't it kind of neat to know that you have high levels in your GI tract where you undergo a lot of digestion, but then within the cell where you're making the most energy, you also have high concentrations to help offset those free radicals from being formed. So yeah, that's really, to me, like this whole area of the mitochondria are so fascinating. And this is the area that I'm getting into, including the fats and like this interplay of the fats and metabolism with bone health and the gut. It is just so fascinating how many systems are involved and just how many areas that melatonin works to improve the health. Like I kind of look at everything now integratively. I look at melatonin not just as, working in this one area of the cell or just this one area of the body. You have to take into account the whole thing. And so whenever I do writings on melatonin, I'll always talk about the system as a whole because it all plays a role in regulating circadian rhythms, which plays an important role in bone and health and cancer and just overall functioning of your organs. But it also is playing a role in regulating certain genes that are involved in like muscle and bone health, metabolic health. It's acting as a free radical scavenger. It's protecting our cells from damage. So there's just so much that it does. It's just a really cool molecule, and it is neat to know that it hasn't changed its structure in billions of years. And that whole story that Russ Ryder talks about with how we evolved from that the whole thing was like, we had high oxygen levels in our atmosphere, unlivable, but they had these cool cyanobacteria, which are purple containing, which I think is interesting from an Ayurvedic perspective because of the sixth chakra system, Agya and Sahasrara, which is associated with melatonin and purple. But these bacteria were able to survive under high oxygen concentrations because they contained melatonin. And then what happened is another cell engulfed it and took on the mitochondria, and they were able to survive. And then what's cool is that, they'll say eukaryotic cells, which are our cells, contain chloroplasts and mitochondria. And over time, because we do respiration, which requires oxygen, over time, we've pulled that oxygen out of the atmosphere to livable levels. Obviously, that took millions of years. But it's kind of like that happened first, and then circadian, we kept advancing as a species, and then we turn in with the circadian rhythms, and then sleep happens. So there was like this continuum of sophistication. And now there's this whole thing because our metabolism is being altered so much by just our society that now we're really starting to examine the effects of melatonin on the mitochondria, which we have to do a deeper dive in that. Like, how do we make ourselves healthier through the mitochondria? Because so many diseases are stemming from damaged mitochondria. And just like what you were saying, these free radicals.
So you said that these very early cells took the oxygen out of the atmosphere. They weren't plant-based, right? Because the plants are actually consuming, carbon dioxide and putting oxygen back out. So what kind of cells were actually sucking all the oxygen out of the atmosphere that allowed humans eventually, or mammals, to actually begin to evolve?
So the cyanobacteria, these are theorized, but they were engulfed by these prokaryotic cells. And then over time, I don't know the specific name, but then over time, they call it endosymbiosis, where with these cells, they all just kind of become one another, and they kind of use their parts to grow and to survive. And so when you start to adopt a system of energy generation like ours, it consumes oxygen rather than putting oxygen out there. So it's almost like they took the melatonin from the purple containing bacteria and used it to stay alive. And then with this respiration, this generation of ATP and water using oxygen, you were slowly able to lower that oxygen. I just love that whole concept because Russ Ryder always says the coolest things, and a lot of this stuff is starting to obviously play a really important role in our society now.
Yeah, Russ Ryder's original book, right? I think it's called Melatonin, was put out in the 1990s. Is still like
That's when I actually entered the field.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, that book I think it's just mind-boggling and so way ahead of its time. And then since then, there's been so much research, and even so much research on cancer. I know that you've done some research on breast cancer. Whenever I have a patient that has cancer, I will do a research search with them right online. I'll say, give me a second. I want to just see if this particular cancer, if melatonin has anything to do with it. And I am just never I had a patient yesterday with bladder cancer, and I looked up bladder cancer, melatonin, and there was study after study after study after study, whether it be breast cancer, whether it be prostate cancer. It's just something about melatonin. And of course, your medical doctor doesn't know anything about it because it's over the counter, and they get most of the information from pharmaceutical reps, so they don't want to talk about melatonin. But it's almost like a crime because the research is just so overwhelming for almost every kind of cancer. And please help us understand, how does melatonin have, I mean, I'm not talking one or two studies, I'm talking about hundreds of studies. You just look up one cancer and it'll just go on and on and on and on, study after study. It's mind-boggling. And I wonder two things. How does that work? And what is the dose that would be something that someone would take to actually have that sort of powerful antioxidant effect, other than just the reset circadian rhythm effect?
Yeah, so I'm like you. When I look at the cancer field, I'm like, it pretty much touches everything. And again, dose does matter. And every cancer has a different etiology or a cause. So a melatonin through different cancers can be working through different mechanisms within a cell. I don't want to get too sciencey, but depending on what's going on in the cell, melatonin can work through receptors and either slow down proliferation through certain proteins in the cell. It can induce differentiation of a cancer cell, because really a cancer cell is undifferentiated cells, but they're still able to gobble up our nutrients and take all the nutrients and oxygen away from the healthy cells. So there's a lot of ways that melatonin can do that. Decrease cell proliferation, division, induce differentiation, because that also slows down cell growth. But also there's many pathways that it works through. But the other way, again, is also through its antioxidant effects and its free radical scavenging effects. And that would be based on dose. And so every study, obviously, and everybody should always consult with their primary care physicians, because melatonin does work through cytochromes and can interfere with metabolism of drugs. So obviously be very careful, like when you're taking it. I always say that melatonin should be taken during the night. So if you're taking a drug at night, you want to offset maybe by a couple of hours. So maybe take your drug before that. I'm not giving clinical advice. This should always be for the doctor, the MDs. But when it's something general, free radical scavenging and antioxidant behavior can benefit all the cancers, because that's kind of like a generalized mechanism. And it's also helping keep your healthy cells alive and not getting killed off. So that's kind of the way we look at the cancers in general. And I forgot, what was your second question?
Well, the dosing, I've seen
the
the
dosing.
talk about the dosing can be very high for
Yeah, like
these
10 milligrams, 20 milligrams I've seen. But again, everybody responds differently to melatonin. So really, like what people report is vivid dreaming. Some people like it, some people don't. I see it even with the 5 milligrams and 3 milligrams. Some people can't take it, they get a headache. Some people get that daytime grogginess. Sometimes that goes away after 2 weeks. Sometimes it doesn't. Then you can just cut your dose in half and see if that goes away. So those are pretty much the main things, how melatonin can impact you. And everybody does respond differently to it. So everybody just has to, again, do what's best for them, and do again, always consult your physician, because that's what works for the person.
What I've done, based on, you told me about a researcher named Al Louie who did research on kind of lower dose melatonin, and the fact that we don't really see a decline in melatonin production until, say, after 50 or say after menopause. So that would be a time where you could use melatonin to sort of hack the aging process and protect against some of this free radical damage and keep your rhythms in sync and all of that. So what I've done is I've started using something called low dose melatonin to microdose, because like you said, a lot of patients, you take a big dose, it feels bad, it works for a little while, it stops working, and next thing you know, they say, it didn't work for me, and they don't try it. So I'll have them start with a microdose, like 0.1 milligram, and do that for 5 nights, and then do 2 drops, which is 0.2 milligrams for 5 nights, and then 3 drops, and then find a microdose that really helps them feel better. And if they feel better, then we stay on that dose. And you also told me, which was really interesting, you've created such an, you don't know how many people that you've helped by
Oh, that's
that,
great.
our interview that we've
Oh,
had. I
that's the
mean,
best.
hundreds and hundreds and maybe even thousands,
Oh, that's wonderful.
because you told me that melatonin is not a hormone officially because it doesn't do what hormones do, which is they suppress the natural production of your own. And you told me, I think, if I get this right, that melatonin will encourage the natural production. So if you're taking a whopping 10, 20 milligrams, which is like elephant dosing, if, the body will respond to that, maybe that is too much, and have an opposite effect. And therefore you blame melatonin, or you take 5 milligrams, doesn't work, and you take more because it's America. We take more, always,
More is
right?
better.
Bigger the better, right? So what I find is when people guess that they find zero point 0.5 milligram, zero point 0.5 milligrams, which is like 5 drops, really microdose. And that works. And then if it starts to not work, I have them actually take less, not more. And so many of my patients who are using melatonin to just sort of hack the aging process or reset their circadian rhythms, once it starts to not work because you're getting what you're taking and now what you're making new, because it encourages that new production, we can actually get off it. Particularly if you're under 50, you don't need to take melatonin because you should make your own. And then you can kind of wean yourself completely off of it and do a circadian rhythm reset. But if you're old like me, then you might find that 1, 2, or 3 drops, which is zero point 1, 2, or 3 milligrams, a tiny dose, has a powerful effect of resetting. And then if you have a condition like osteoporosis or a cancer issue, then we can go up into clinical dosage. So that's what I've been doing based on our original conversation. And I wonder if you think what do you think about that?
I think it's great. And what I kept hearing, what you were saying is balance, and everybody's different. So
Right.
it's like everybody just, it's not a one size fits all. You have to go with your body. You have to go with whatever's comfortable for you. And I think you're doing a great thing. And it is, again, dependent upon what your intention is. So, and not everybody loses their nocturnal peaks of melatonin. That could be a lifestyle thing. But more than likely, it is age-related decline, exactly when you said. In menopause, it's between 40 and 50, you start to see those nocturnal peaks going down. And sometimes by the age of 80, there's like no visible peak. So in those instances, sometimes it's help. And even if you put on an eye mask or you do natural things where you're eating ginger or walnuts, tart cherry capsules, anything like that, that could bump up nocturnal production. Even lavender, they showed could even bump up, and it makes kind of
Oh,
sense.
nice.
We use lavender in Ayurveda for relaxing people and helping them sleep. Now, there's evidence to suggest that it can bump up melatonin levels. If that doesn't happen and your intended purpose is to keep your levels at a physiological state, then you would do the low dosing. And everybody's different because their bioavailability is different. Like everyone is about 15% bioavailable, but everybody could go down as low as 3%. So that's where you're having to alter the doses because it's how much is actually getting into the system to cause an effect. And that's what's great is you're working with your patients trying to figure out what suits them because there's a lot of things that goes into a dose. The person's health history, risk factors, their want to take a dose, they're just like they're whatever the condition they're trying to treat. And again, like you're doing, you step it up slowly, take it off. So I always think of melatonin as this balancing hormone. It's always about maintaining appropriate balance. Too much could be bad, too little might not be effective. It's the same principle of medicine to poison to toxicity. My PhD is in pharmacology and toxicology. So it's like when I teach my students just about hormones, I'll start out with like water we need, but too much water can lead to hyponatremia and toxicity. Glucose we need, but too much can lead to diabetes. Oxygen we need, but too much can lead to oxidative stress in the body. So it's always maintaining a healthy balance. And so just like you said, I always say that it depends on what you're going for. If you're going for preventative care, try and just and you have measured your nocturnal levels and they are lower, bump it up to get to physiological levels, about 80 to 100 picograms per mil. But if you're going for therapeutic, where you're trying to actually reverse bone loss or osteoporosis, then you would want to go into the higher doses. Like I said, 3 to 5 milligrams. That's what we're using. And even, like I said, some cancer patients would be put on 10 milligrams. But again, it's all dependent on that person.
You also mentioned that melatonin doesn't have an LD50. Can you explain what an LD50 is and how that works?
Well, so we gotta be careful with this because there have been these issues with children getting into gummies with
Yeah.
melatonin, have reported toxicities. So you got to be super careful with that. So according to the literature, when they try and do lethal dose at, where you have 50% death, the doses that they went up to didn't cause death in the animals that they were testing them in. So I just want to say this carefully, just because when you make these, you just have to be careful, like who's ingesting it, how much are they ingesting? It was just under those experimental conditions that it has very low toxicity. And if anything, the higher doses, we were talking about, again, 5 milligrams, those are considered high doses. 10 milligrams, that again, it flips into a free radical scavenging antioxidant behavior that could be protective. But again, I just always want to be careful because I don't want people to go out and start pounding lots of melatonin because
Exactly.
again, that could be dependent on their conditions, but there were toxicity reports with pediatrics, and you just got to be careful because they were thinking that was candy. So just be careful with
Yeah, I
that.
think that makes so much sense because children are making massive amounts of melatonin naturally, and you're going to make a lot of melatonin until you see that age-related decline. So that's why in my practice, I would never even think about giving melatonin to a child. And for someone who's having sleep issues or circadian rhythm issues, which is like, unfortunately, a lot of people in our culture, the low dose melatonin where they get on a micro dose and then they wean off as a reset agent. That's something that I do. I also, based on the research done at UC Boulder here, they did studies where they took healthy Boulder people and they measured their circadian rhythms and cortisol, and they were completely out of whack. Melatonin was surging in the middle of the day, and they were taking caffeine to stay up, and so-called healthy people living on caffeine kind of thing. And they took a group of them into the mountains, and for a week, and they no sun, no electricity, up with the sun, bed with the sun, totally blackout kind of situation. And in 1 week, they had a complete reset of their circadian rhythms and biological clocks. And they did a second study with just a weekend. It was like a 69% restoration. So I often add people, I tell them, do no artificial light weekend, turn off all the lights, go off the grid, just do it in the summertime, which is great because you can just like go to bed when the sun goes down at 9 o'clock and you're out and just get back into turn off all the electricity and the Wi-Fi. And you can reset it yourself, or you could add a low dose melatonin kind of micro dosing reset. But I totally agree that, it is a concern when children are taking more and we start thinking in America that more is better and the higher the better, the higher the dose, the better. And that even though melatonin is relatively safe, has been around for 3 billion years, we have to be, reasonable about it.
Not babies, but children, if they have sleep issues, it's been proven to be effective, but very low dose. And of course, contact pediatrician and all of that. I was just saying that kids were getting into these and eating them like
Gummies.
candy. And so
Yeah.
that was the problem. But I love that whole thing that you were saying about the camping. I would like to always make sure that people know that just having the natural rhythms of the light dark cycle are the most healthy. Like you can go into complete darkness and you'll still have circadian rhythms of melatonin because they're on their own rhythm. The light dark cycle kind of syncs them up with its daytime melatonin levels are low, its nighttime melatonin levels should be high. So I always say, try and just have the natural rhythms of the environment. And again, some people have trouble sleeping and they like to sleep with the black shades, and some people are shift workers, and that's all based on what your lifestyle is like. But I have found that when I sleep with my shades open and I get the moonlight or I get this natural sunlight, like I wake up naturally. and pretty refreshed rather than kind of like not knowing, is it daytime yet or is it nighttime yet? So I do my best. I always tell everybody, just do your best. I know we're all trying to do our best to maintain this healthy lifestyle. And if you can get out in nature and be with nature, that's our best teacher.
So I read some studies about how the moon and the full moon can have an effect on melatonin. Can you comment on that? I mean, were you supposed to just like, do an all-nighter on the moon, on the full moon? Like how does that work in an evolutionary sense?
I love how timely that is because we are experiencing a full moon today.
Exactly, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I'd love to equate it to a study since we were talking about cancer. Can I do that?
Yeah, yeah, please.
So people do dim light studies, which is about zero point 0.2 lux, which would be the equivalent to the full moon on a clear sky. And that does cause a little bit of a bump up in, it affects the melatonin rhythms. Because remember, light, specifically blue light, inhibits melatonin levels. And then it's the darkness that stimulates melatonin. It's the lack of light perception on the eye through the retina. So even a moonlight a full moon can still generate enough light to suppress the levels, but it's much lower than a 12-12 light dark with like 300 lux, which would be like office light. So this is such a cool study, and these people are so neat with how they did their work because then it sort of relates to a drug that I'm developing. But one of the problems taking cancer drugs is cancer resistance. So just like you said, over time, your body can get accustomed to a drug. So the drug we study is tamoxifen. So it's an estrogen receptor positive anti-cancer drug. So it acts to block estrogen from interacting with its receptor. But one of the problems with it is it can cause the uterus to start growing because it acts as a stimulator in the uterus. And over time, it could predispose people to endometrial or uterine cancer, especially if they take it to prevent ER positive cancer if it runs in their family. So they can desensitize to it. And that just happens with chronic drug therapy over time. But this group, what they did is they showed that under dim light conditions, they implanted these ER positive breast cancer cells, and they grew much faster under dim light versus 12-12 light dark, like office light during the day, darkness during the night. And then they found that tamoxifen resistance happened to a greater extent. And then when they took the dim light, added melatonin back, they found that they could resensitize those estrogen receptors with tamoxifen, showing the importance of having a normal light-dark cycle. Like our bodies need to go through that 12 hours of day, 12 hours of night, even with drug therapies. And so I thought that was like super cool because I always want to emphasize the importance of having natural light during the day as much as you can. I know people work and they're in offices, but if you could just go outside for 15 minutes at least and just sit outside, that could do your body's wonders and then have dark sleep at night. So just with health, because so many things are under a circadian rhythm, our bones, our muscles, our liver, our adrenal glands. I mean, like everything is rhythmic. Our GI enzymes. So that's why sometimes eating, like in Ayurveda, we always ask, say people to try to not eat 2 hours before bed. There's, reasons for that. But really, you don't want to try not to eat too much during the night just because your body is not prepared to digest that food. And that's where you can start throwing off those radicals because your body is not prepared to handle all that food. So I always talk about rhythms and staying in seasonally, like we're moving into long days now. So again, you're probably going to feel different with these rhythms and your melatonin levels are going to adjust to that. So, but I think it's interesting that just from a health perspective, how important natural rhythms are, light dark cycles, but also in terms of drug therapies, they're really important. And the other thing this group showed, is that tumors feed at different, they have feeding times. They actually, tumor feeding is on a circadian rhythm where they feed more in the daytime using linoleic acid than nighttime. And that's because probably, and they show that it's the melatonin that is suppressing the tumor feeding during the night. So I always like to propose chronotherapy for drug therapy. So like if you're undergoing treatments, link them up with that person's cycles because they could have better effects of the drugs if they're synced up. But again, it's personalized medicine. It costs a lot of money. It costs, extra care. But I don't know. I think in the long term, it's going to be very beneficial for people. And it's a simple fix, just knowing people's rhythms.
Would that mean like taking the chemotherapy drug during the daytime or at nighttime, or how would
It
that
would
work?
depend, like they would have to know like what the tumor feeding time is. So like
Right.
in this study, they found that the tumors fed during the day when melatonin levels were low. And then they found that the tumors fed less at night when melatonin levels were high. And they did a beautiful study. And this is David Blask and Stephen Hill's work at Tulane University and Dauchi. But they proved that it was the melatonin and through receptors. So I like to give them a lot of credit because they do phenomenal work with this whole chronobiology. Uh,
Would,
I I think it's so important.
would that potentially suggest that there may be a time where you would take melatonin therapeutically during the daytime?
Yeah, there could be times again during the, depends on what your outcome is, but again, you're going to have changes in your sleep cycles. So again, that's where you would want to get somebody who is an expert in chronobiology and ways to approach that. That's a little bit out of my area of expertise. So I like to just throw that idea out there because I think it's worth mentioning because people probably don't know that tumors have circadian rhythms at times where they like to feed.
Yeah.
It's kind of new, not, I mean, this older study, it's still, more than 10 years old, but still something that I think what you said kind of does, people don't talk about that. But I think I don't know why that is when you mentioned that like people don't know about melatonin or don't talk about it. I'm not sure why that is. And so I guess what that pleases me so much that you say that people listen to this because I'm always trying to empower the person with knowledge. And, I want my goal in life is to always have people live a high quality life without having to, you don't have to be, you don't have it, no matter what your socioeconomic status is, you can live a high quality life, have good health if you just know some of these simple things.
Yeah, and the nice thing is that it can work with your oncologist or, and
Of
when I
course.
send people all these studies, and they're, when you get that cancer diagnosis, it's a life-changing, you know, we talked about, Candace Pert's work, where when you have that emotional stress from a cancer diagnosis, it not only impacts your nervous system, not only impacts your emotional system, but impacts your immune system. Like those molecules of emotion, that book she wrote shows that it has an impact on everything. So when you get that cancer diagnosis, it just sends a wave of compromised immunity, compromised, ability to cope with this issue. And, when I can send people study after study after study after study showing what melatonin can actually do for them, where their oncologist won't tell them that because it's unfortunately not on our radar. It just gives them such hope, and that just and there's so many things you can do with a cancer diagnosis to change your mindset, and there's great science on that. But this is also another thing, and they look at those studies and go, oh my gosh, this is something that might really help me and give them that ability to boost their immune response. There also is the question about people
But
who
can I
live.
add something to that?
Yeah, yeah, please.
I love that you said that because there are studies out there that if, you have drug A that is old drug, but that person wants to take it, but the new sexy drug is drug B and it's more efficacious, that person will do better on drug A than drug B because they will own their health. And that's one of the reasons because I totally agree with you is that what I'm trying to do, so we're developing a drug that links melatonin with tamoxifen, and we're showing pretty good effects of this, even in like tamoxifen resistant cell lines, triple negatives, cancer cell lines. The whole reason of developing that drug is for those kinds of things you just said. We want to enhance the efficacy of tamoxifen through melatonin because it's good anti-cancer drug. We want to protect the bones, but we also want to maintain those sleep rhythms so the person can feel good, not get their sleep out of whack, so they can approach their condition with gusto. Like they can have hope, they can feel good, they'll want to get better. So I totally love that qualitative aspect. That's why in every trial we run, we always do subject reported outcomes. We fill out questionnaires. Like you can say to someone, that drug's going to help you. And that person says, I don't want to take that drug. Do you think they're going to do good on that, do well on that drug? No, because they have stress. Cortisol lowers your immune system, makes you susceptible. They're not going to sleep. They're going to have anxiety. So I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I did a podcast with Dr. Sam Watts, who was an oncologist. Now he's sort of an Ayurvedic natural doctor from the UK. And he talked about a study with Dr. Simiton, who was an oncologist in LA back in the 90s. And he noticed that people who had a positive attitude, right, they did better with their cancer. So he did a study with 159 people who were terminally ill, cancer. They had 4 years, 1 year to live. It was a 4-year study. And they did guided imagery, and to help give them that positive reinforcement to help keep their nervous system, that molecules of motion staying positive, and had a powerful effect. There was something like 26% of that group of the 159 had a complete remission, like 22% had significant reduction. Another 20 something percent basically were stabilized, and then the rest of the group, maybe did worse. But we're talking about over 70% of that group either did better or had no negative changes, only by guided imagery. And what you're talking about is giving people something positive, because that's, the placebo effect is real.
It's
and,
real.
and that positive effect of, having that hope is such a powerful tool. And so I just think it's so neat that you're combining melatonin with these other drugs. They're sort of really smart drugs in a way that are helping work with the body's intelligence, not just overruling everything that our body's trying to do.
And interventions that are non-pharmacological. So I always think that that's really cool. I'm going to say one thing about the placebo effect. So we always say when people are in our trial, like at the end when it's published, if they want to know what group they were in, and some people get really like, oh no, I was in the placebo group. Oh, I thought I was really on whatever the internet. And I go, that's a good thing. I go, your mind is so powerful. Like you were able to overcome that. Like that's a great thing. And I that's why I like my Ayurvedic training. It just helps me see the world a little bit differently. Like I said, I think that's a good thing. Placebos are important to run. In the herbal world, it's hard to run placebos.
Yeah, I mean, it's so cool talking to you because, obviously your pharmacological training, your research on cancer and osteoporosis, I mean, you're so brilliant. Yet, Dr. Paula went through Ayurvedic training, so she really understands the value of what Ayurveda is really about is how can we, not treat the condition of this individual? How do we treat the patient who has the condition and try to find the upstream cause? So when you listen to her doing, groundbreaking research using melatonin, which we know it has anti-cancer properties, combined with tamoxifen, which has side effects that actually cause cancer. I mean, this is brilliant work when you take the ancient wisdom, the knowledge you have, and combining it with modern science. And ancient wisdom is melatonin. I got into melatonin only because of a deep dive into Ayurvedic circadian rhythms, because Ayurveda is all about times of day and the rhythms of nature and
That's
how we
why
need
I
to
got
be.
into Ayurveda.
Right. Yeah. Right.
I went to my training. I said, "Oh my gosh, when they're talking about chronobiological effects, like what is this?" And I'm like, I have to learn more because it just blew me away.
Yeah. It's actually really beautiful to talk to you and the work you're doing. I'm glad that I'm sad that you didn't know, and my bad for not telling you, but your research is helping a lot of
Oh,
people. It's
that's
outside of just your research world, the people that I talk to every
uh,
day and the people on my website. It's
thank
really,
you.
really fantastic,
As I get older,
fantastic.
that you don't know how much that means to me. It just means
Yeah.
everything to me.
Yeah, well, and I'm so glad you're willing to come on and talk about these things because they're so important. A lot of people also, we know that the circadian rhythms, like there was a study I saw with aspirin. If you take it during the day, it doesn't really have that much of effect for say lowering blood pressure, but if you take it at night, it has this powerful effect. So there's drugs all have their circadian biological clocks. So I want to see if, kind of just see if you have any more to talk about that. And also want to talk about just when people live, above the Arctic Circle, like in Alaska, and now they have, they have, so much sun during the summer and so little sun during the winter. And how do they manage that? And I think you have a lot to say about that as well.
Well, I don't work with those people, but I know that they are very important groups when we talking about seasonal and light changes. So what I have seen in the literature with that is just kind of like what you would expect if you have a longer, seasonal where you have more light, like longer summers, longer days, that could be suppressing melatonin levels over time, causing, health conditions. Again, I'm not super up on the epidemiological studies on that, so I don't want to say anything that's not correct. But I do know that in these circles, like people would have to possibly offset by health, by their lifestyles, these extreme conditions where you have long periods of darkness or long periods of light. And so again, that would affect sleep rhythms. And sleep for me is everything. Like when I do anything with a client or anything I actually work with students a lot. So, and I go in and do workshops for college age students because they have a lot of anxiety and stress. And I really focus on sleep and ways with sleep hygienes and just how to get people back to normal sleep rhythm. So, I think that doing things like having a good sleep hygiene, especially in the longer days where you're getting so much light, that's where the dark shades would be helpful. Like you want to keep trying to mimic that light dark cycle or extreme dark all the time. You'd want to introduce more light during the right periods of time. And I always just that's why I keep trying to emphasize this light dark cycle is very important for maintaining good health. Just having this rhythm of light and dark. And so too much light, add darkness, too much darkness, add light. And obviously you can't add natural lighting, but you can definitely work with light therapy during those extreme cases. But the thing with what you were saying about aspirin, and that's where I was bringing in the enzymes. Because a lot of times when you are taking a drug, there's sometimes it's better to take a drug at a certain time of the day because it has the enzymes required to break it down into its active molecules. And that all has to do because your liver is also under a circadian rhythm. And so that's probably why you see different efficacies of a drug depending on when you take it. But just so you know, inflammation also runs on a circadian rhythm. And when do you feel most achy? Probably right towards the end of the day. I do. I feel like if I have inflammation, it's really going to show up for me like right around, like going around dusk. So for me, when I take an anti-inflammatory, for me, it's most effective hitting it right when it's peaking at that time. So again, isn't that kind of neat to know that even our bodies, like understanding the circadian rhythms of our enzymes, like all of our organs are under rhythms. And when you have disrupted sleep, when you have light exposure at night, if you're burning the midnight oil and you're working with these bright blue lights, and yes, I understand and I say this to students all the time, I'm like, if you're a student, you do the best you can because you are a student. But when you get out into the working world, try and get back to this balance where you're not working with a light at night because that's going to suppress your melatonin levels. That's going to induce sympathetic nervous system activation. that's going to start secreting cortisol because your cortisol really should be high at about 8 a.m. Your cortisol should be high at 8 a.m. and then start going down after that. But in our modern world, we're exercising, drinking lots of coffee. People have night shift work, so their cortisol rhythms are kind of going like that. And that's going to lead to adrenal fatigue over time. And you can't really get that back once you have it because you've wiped out your adrenal systems. And again, it's this modern world that we live in. So much of what I try and do is I try and go into the younger people. Their world's so much different than mine when I grew up. I have two young daughters. My daughters are 32 and 26, so they're right in that world that I really remember very well. And I'm like, I just want to try and counteract that. So I'm really into preventative medicine, kind of like what you were alluding to with the lower dose melatonin, just to bump up your levels, just to keep them physiological so that you have a good base to deal with this world. It's hitting us at so many things like the phone, the activity, like even commercials, like I'm sure when you look at them, they're so much faster. The picture just changes so much faster. We're getting so much information, so much overload. It's very hard for people to quiet their minds. And so I practice yoga and meditation and Ayurveda. And to me, it's the most powerful thing I've ever done for myself. So I
Hmm.
can't say enough about it. It blows me away. I also do Marma, and
Hmm.
that just blows me away, just how powerful it is.
So I have one last question for you, and it's something that I read about in Russ Ryder's first book, Melatonin, and he talked about seasonal breeding and how during the winter months, the melatonin increase in melatonin in cultures who didn't have any light at all, they didn't have the ability to get pregnant during those periods, and they got pregnant only during in the spring. So they would have their babies at the right time and not have a baby, in October where you're now just have this baby during this freezing cold winter, and they would be less survival. So a lot of people on the web are talking that melatonin you shouldn't take because it creates, infertility because of that suppression. Do you have any comment on that? I mean, I'm talking about low dose, and we're really talking about restoring physiological levels here. We're not talking about overruling the body with mega doses of melatonin. I get that. But do you have any comment on that? I mean, I kind of feel like when you look at the research on cancer, it's overwhelming. The research you're doing is overwhelming on bone density. How do we, are we talking, I mean, the melatonin doses we're talking about, could that have anything to do with infertility? Like in a culture where they didn't have fire, they didn't have lights, they lived 100% during a season in Alaska above the Arctic Circle where it was 100% dark during those periods. So that created a circadian rhythm of fertility that was on and off during those cycles. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so the whole melatonin was really, like, at least in the earlier stages, really talked about hibernating animals. And that's a lot where a lot of the bottle systems took place. And exactly for those reasons, you want to increase your chance of survival by having the offspring during times where they could survive, not in the dead of winter. You see that with the birds all the time. So the research is, we've done research in that area with melatonin and the hormones. And what I know, and I agree, again, if you maintain a healthy balance and you're restoring levels that are physiological, I don't see that's not going to really impact on fertility. If anything, it might help with fertility just because you're restoring proper circadian rhythms, and that when you sleep well, you're going to do better. You're not going to be stressed out because there's a lot that goes into infertility. So you're thinking, if you're looking at it from a hormonal perspective, there's some evidence to suggest that high doses, people have proposed that melatonin could be used to shut down ovulation through the gonadotropic axis. But again, that's high doses if you look at those studies. But melatonin does have an impact on just what, even in the work that I've done, looking, when we follow the follicular and the luteal phases of the menstrual cycle, melatonin seems to trend more with progesterone. So there seems to be some type of relationship of melatonin with progesterone levels, and a lot of people have shown that. So again, what I always want to caution is low physiological or low dose is better. If to me, if you can maintain the cycles of your body and your overall health, that can only improve your health outcomes. So, and again, a high dose of anything, just like I said, oxygen, glucose, water, that's gonna do things to your body. The same with melatonin. But I think we're really in a place right now where we're really trying to get a grasp on what does melatonin do to our reproductive cycles. And like I said, with those micro doses, to me, that would only improve things because you're regulating sleep cycles. And again, through that antioxidant behavior, if we're going to talk about transitioning women, perimenopausal to menopausal, melatonin could help protect oocytes from damage because of the free radical scavenging. And that's partly how people have thought of melatonin be this anti-aging, because this was so cool when I was at a bone conference. This person was talking about how the oocyte was very much linked to aging and bone health. And so when I was thinking of that, I'm like, oh, maybe melatonin, when people think like that, it's because it's protecting the oocyte from getting damaged, keeping the eggs around longer, keeping a woman from going through menopause longer. So it takes, they go into it a little bit later. But again, like I said, low physiological is the best. Cycles, maintain cycles, stay within the rhythms. And then, like I said, I think melatonin is such a cool molecule. It has so many great things to offer our world. Depends on how you want to use it. You can use it naturally, bump up your levels with a mask. Lavender can bump up your levels. Certain foods contain it. I think you had a list of foods on your website. I think you offered that to people.
Yeah.
Again, your low dose, titrating it based on the person. Everyone's different. So don't think that one dose is going to do the same as another dose to another person. So think of everything as in balance and what works best for you. And always consult your physicians again, because the goal is to make you healthy and to make you have a high quality of life.
Wow, amazing. Paula, what your research, you're doing such great research. I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for you coming on and sharing your research. I know last time we had some links on the last podcast to the actual studies that you did, which was really cool. Is there a way people can see more of your research, and how would they do that?
Yeah, sure. I could, if you want, I can send you links to the journals where they're accessible. Most of them are free for download. So people, they're interested in always, I hear from a lot of people. I'm always careful. I don't want to give clinical advice, but I always say, not giving clinical advice, but you can show your physician this. And I always give them papers and I try and explain things to them because, as I'm getting older and, more mature in my career, and I know it sounds corny, but I really want people to lead healthy lives. I always believe a rising tide lifts all boats. I work with the younger people because I just want them to go out into the world, with a good mind and healthy bodies and to have discernment. And so that's really what my goal is. So I would be happy if people ever want to email me. I'll provide links. If you want to tell me what papers you would want me to put out, I'd be happy to do that. The goal is always just to help people lead high quality lives, and whatever that means to that person.
No, that's great. We'll definitely put those in the show notes and link them so people can watch the podcast and then go into the details of your work. Your work is amazing. Thanks for doing this again. I really appreciate it. And you have an open invitation to come back anytime when you publish more research. We would love to help put it out there for you
when the studies that I'm doing now come out, I think they're pretty cool. We're doing the bone loading plus melatonin study. We do a muscle intervention study with melatonin, or looking at melatonin rhythms, hormone rhythms, but I'm also doing a holistic one with the herbal pillows. And so we're going to look at that on quality of life and also sleep
beautiful.
activity rhythms. So I would love to talk about those because, again, my goal is to have things that are accessible to everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. All right. Thank you so much
All
for
right,
coming.
thank you.
And we'll talk again very soon. Hi everybody, I just want to take a minute and tell you what we do here at LifeSpa.com. I've been in practice now for 40 years, 38 of them have been practicing Ayurvedic medicine full-time. For the last 20 years, I've been writing articles and doing videos on the ancient medical wisdom of Ayurveda with the modern science. If something's been around for 1,000 years, still practiced today, and you have modern science to prove it, I really feel like that's something we should all be taking a look at. And that's what we do at LifeSpa.com, and all that information is for free. So just go to LifeSpa.com and search in your health topic, and you'll get the information, the article that you need, hopefully that will help you. While you're there, check out our Ayurvedic store. You can get there through LifeSpa.com or go to store.lifespa.com. And there we have all of our organic Ayurvedic herbs, organic skincare line, more books, tapes, knowledge that we give you is all there at our store. All of our cleansing kits are there in our store. All of our herbs are whole herbs with the natural occurring microbiome, the way it came out of the soil. And that's critically important, because if I took the bugs out of you, you'd be completely different. We take the bugs away from a plant, like sterilizing, making an extract, or spraying your food with pesticides. You lose significant benefit of that plant. And that's why we use the whole plant with the natural occurring microbiome. So check us out, learn more about what we're doing here at LifeSpa.com, and we'll see you again.
This recording is brought to you by LifeSpa, where ancient Ayurvedic wisdom meets modern science. Get access to free health video newsletters by Dr. John at LifeSpa.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.